Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is September 23rd, 2014, and my guest is Luigi Zingales, the Robert C. McCormick Distinguished Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance at the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. He's the author of a very provocative and utterly fascinating piece, Preventing Economists' Capture, that appeared as a chapter in a book on regulatory capture published last year. And his essay is the subject of today's episode. Luigi, welcome back to EconTalk.
My pleasure. I love to be back.
Now, preventing economist capture is not about kidnapping or abduction. Your piece is about, thank you, your piece is about the biases that economists bring to their research and their policy positions. I want to start, as you do in the paper, with the idea of regulatory capture in general and how economists view the incentives facing regulators.
Yes, I think it's very important to explain to ordinary people that when economists talk about regulatory capture, i.e. the fact that the regulators tend to design regulation more in favor of the industry that they regulate than in favor of the public that they are supposed to protect. They don't imply that regulators are corrupt or they lack integrity. Certainly, around the world, there are examples of corrupt regulators, but I think in the United States, by and large, that's not the case. And on the one hand, this is great news. On the other hand, this makes it more difficult to both understand and fight the kind of capture that economists talk about. So let me try to explain what they mean. They mean that when you do your job, you tend to be affected inevitably, almost psychologically, by the people who provide you the information, the people who follow you, and also, in addition to that, the people who can give you a job in the future. But even without going to the third element, that maybe is the most creepy one, if you want, let's start with the first two that seems to be very benign, but they're quite important. As a regulator, I need information about the industry. I need to know what the problems are. And the best source for this data are exactly the people I regulate. So if I am too tough with the regulated, I end up not receiving the very information that is necessary for my business. The second aspect is very few of us, ordinary people, follow what happens days in and days out in regulation. So take the Environmental Protection Agency. If I need to regulate some emission, most people don't pay attention of the exact level of emission. And short of a catastrophe, this decision will not be revealed and discussed by ordinary citizens. On the other hand, the industry that is regulated will pay a great deal of attention to all the little details because its profitability will depend massively by these regulatory decisions. And so the regulator will naturally pay more attention because the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And if I am a regulator and I am in doubt about what is the exact sort of threshold for emission or whatever number you want to input in a regulation, there is always some uncertainty of what is the precise number. And what I do know is if I make a mistake in one direction, I'm immediately exposed and ridiculed by the industry. If I make a mistake in the other direction, chances are that nobody will find out. So naturally, even without being a cynical bastard, I will inevitably tend to make mistakes only in one direction. And notice I've mentioned all these things without even entering what, at least in the regulatory capture discussion, is probably the most important aspect, which is my career incentives. If I'm a regulator, generally I don't get a lot of money doing the job I do. The moment I step down as a regulator and I go to work for the industry, I make much more money. And so it's really tempted for me not to burn my bridges with the industry, because if I'm considered the worst guy for the industry, chances are that when I step down, I would not receive a job. So all these facts together make unbiased regulation very difficult to take place, even in the complete absence of any corruption, at least in the form in which we mean traditional corruption.
So that's a well-discussed phenomenon in the economic literature, the fact that regulators get co-opted, get captured, have incentives to not do their job. And this is part of a larger literature in public choice that politicians and regulators don't necessarily, maybe not even come close to, serving the public interest, or whatever that is, a phrase I don't like because it masks the complexity of our preferences. But put that to the side. So this is a common argument put forward by economists. You have the startling claim in your paper that maybe economists face the same incentives that regulators do, and maybe we're not so straightforward and honest. So explain why your analysis, why economists might be subject to some of these pressures.
So I basically try to apply the same rule that we apply to regulators to ourselves. And so there is no doubt that most regulators are honest people that try to do the greater good. And in spite of that, we economists think that they might fall prey of the industry they regulate for the reasons I just explained. So I start from the same premise, and most of my colleagues and myself are people that are really dedicated to research, the public good, really honest and decent people. But we might be captured in the same way, subtle ways in which regulators are captured. So I pointed out three ways in which sort of regulators could be captured. The first one is information. And this is a bit the same thing for economists. A late colleague of mine used to say that if I am an entomologist, I don't have to socialize with bugs. If I'm a business professor, why should I socialize with business people? And this reflects the attitude of an older generation of academics that was quite far from the business world. Today, things are different, and I actually claim that even entomologists, if they could socialize with bugs, they will happily do it because they get more insight about how bugs work and so on and so forth. So the point I'm making here is that it's intrinsic to our profession, especially for people who do business economics and finance, to interact with
to socialize with the bugs. Yeah,
exactly. And so we get sort of some rub-off from the bugs. I think when you socialize with somebody, it's natural that you tend to take their view of the world and to be more sympathetic and so on and so forth. So,
but you raised the more insightful point in your paper is that you raised the question. You understand why we might socialize with the business people. Why do they socialize with us?
I think that they find it useful to be able to shape our views. I think that especially shrewd business people know how important is the reputation of what they do. And communication is now an important part of every business. And communication with the academic world is an important part of it. And so they like to sponsor our conference, to come to our meetings, and to say things. And I always noticed that it was interesting because there is this Western Finance Association, And the NYSE, the New York Stock Exchange, started to sponsor a breakfast at the Western Finance Association immediately after the 1987 crash. And NASDAQ started to sponsor another breakfast at the association immediately after the scandal about alleged collusion on quotes on NASDAQ. So it's interesting that these things don't happen just by accident. Business people see the value of influencing academia, and they play their game. And you cannot blame them to play the game. That's part of what profit maximization is about. Unfortunately or fortunately, banks don't do the same. So I think that we have to be careful. We have to be more aware than entomologists about that risk because we are more exposed to that risk.
Yeah, I think you're right about those breakfasts. I don't think they were just worrying about whether economists were hungry. I think it was probably just a little bit maybe self-interested. I can't help but think of Adam Smith's beautiful quote from The Theory of Moral Sentiments when I hear about you applying this model of capture to economists. Here's what Smith said. He is a bold surgeon, they say, whose hand does not tremble when he performs an operation upon his own person. And he is often equally bold who does not hesitate to pull off the mysterious veil of self-delusion, which covers from his view the deformities of his own conduct. So you're suggesting, end of quote, so you're suggesting that we have some of the same deformities that the regulators have. And before you make the case, I just want to take two incredible, beautiful examples you use in the book of regulatory capture outside of economics, outside of the economics profession. The first is nuclear power in France, a speculation I had never heard before. Talk about your insight or someone's insight into why France has so much nuclear power.
Oh, it's very simple. If I am an engineer, especially a nuclear engineer, there are two things. One is I probably started this profession is because I love this particular field. And so I'm in love with all the creation of the field, including nuclear power. The second, which is more like in the line of standard economic reasoning, once I became an expert in nuclear power, the value of my human capital is highly dependent on the success of the nuclear power industry. So it's very unlikely that as a nuclear power expert, I'm going to start advocating against nuclear power. And even without thinking that I am literally bought off by the industry or people pay me to say, to lie, I tend to view the world in a slightly different way. And it's not a coincidence, at least in my view, that the country with the largest fraction of nuclear power is France, a country run by engineers, in the sense that the way to become part of the French elite is to go to the École Polytechnique and study engineering. And only the very top of the École Polytechnique make into the French civil servants and into the administration. So I think that if you have a country that is run by engineers, you are more likely to have a local nuclear plants. And if you're a country run by people with a degree in finance, you're going to think that every finance creation is great.
So that's a nice segue into the second example, which I just loved. You said, I don't know if it's true, you don't have a source, but I assume you heard it from a horse's mouth. You say, a revealing anecdote comes from a Bush Treasury official who noted that in the heat of the financial crisis, every time there was a phone call from Manhattan's 212 area code, the message was the same: buy the toxic assets. Such uniformity of advice makes it difficult for even the most intelligent or well-meaning policymakers not to be influenced. So that's an example, again, where just the flow of information that came into the policymakers' world was overwhelmingly pushed in one direction.
Yes, I think that, first of all, if you are Paulson, you come from Goldman, and you face a problem, you're likely to ask your friends, your trusted friends for a suggestion. And if your trusted friends are all in finance and they all bought a lot of bad mortgages, your trusted friends will probably push in one direction. And I think this is normal. I'm not saying that this is terrible. What is terrible is when there is not variety. One of my favorite sentences is the one that the late Prime Minister of France, Georges Clemenceau, once said, is that the war is too serious a matter to let the generals run it. And this is
it's a deep truth.
Some sense, this is in some sense against specialization, but it is true that when you are overly specialized, you tend to miss the forest from the tree. And I think that if an administration is too much full of generals, they're going to do sort of a terrible war. If they are sort of too full of finance people, they tend to come out with measures that are too much pro-finance. I think that is just the nature of the beast.
So let's talk about economists. They're not regulating in the literal way the decisions made by industry. So in what sense can economists be captured? What's the analogy between the regulatory capture example and what we do in our day-to-day research and policy advocacy?
So first of all, let's start with data. Nowadays, it's very sexy and trendy to either use proprietary data for certain analysis or to do field study about a certain topic. Now, the best researchers guarantee themselves against being prevented from publishing the research they do. Still, there is a very subtle quid pro quo about what I'm doing. So if I partner with some payday loan with one payday loan firms to do some field experiments, I probably don't want to come up with a result to say that payday loan are
exploit poor people.
Exactly. And so it's not that I am sort of prevented from doing that. Like the regulator is not prevented to really go after the industry. But the incentives are such that I probably will sort of fine-tune and try not to look at the worst things and look at the things I can look at. And so inevitably, the research is going to be a bit biased. Now, we know every research is a bit biased. I don't think that anybody owes the truth. But in general, we come to the conclusion that if we sum across research, those individual biases cancel out, and as a result, the average is pretty accurate. What I'm saying is because the data in this case are controlled by people with a particular interest, even if you take the integral of all this research, the overall picture tends not to be unbiased. And again, it's not that any single piece is terrible, but when you analyze the overall research agenda or research result, you want to understand that this bias exists and try to undo it. And all too often, we tend to ignore that.
So that's one example. That's where people are beholden to the industry for data or analysis. And of course, if there are people who the industry trusts, and because they know how their research is going to come out, and so they're happy to give it to them, even with no strings attached, because they know that person might even have a track record. So and you talk about that. So that's one example. What are some of the others?
Another one is simply the success of your research. The success is not only given by how many other colleagues cite you, but indirectly also how popular your research becomes. Because if my research is portrayed in every newspaper, eventually this is going to trickle down on more citations, and I will become more important in my field as a result of that. So I tend to have an incentive, especially early on in my career, to establish myself, to come up with provocative statements that tend to be sort of more biased in favor of business Why? Because the natural audiences, the one that listen to me, are more business-oriented. So like every Secretary of Labor tend to be more biased in favor of labor, every sort of finance professor tend to be more biased in favor of finance and against labor. It's the nature of the audience. And again, it's not so terrible that, unless we don't recognize that and try to undo that at the aggregate level.
And then two other examples. You have editors. Talk about the publishing process. For those people who aren't used to the ugly kitchen of economic and scholarly research publication. We've talked a little bit about it on EconTalk in the past, but give us an idea of how the actual process works. You're an assistant professor, example you talk about in the essay. You're an assistant professor, and you send – what happens to you when you write a paper?
Let me start with this for your general audience, that the life of a professor is great except when you have to go through the process of submitting and receiving insults from your referees and trying to convince them that you have produced the best piece of work since sliced bread and so on and so forth. And this process is not the same across different fields. In particular, in economics, there are two features that are quite important for what I want to say. The first one is that it takes a long time to get a paper published. So you submit a paper, and if you're lucky, you receive a response in 4, 5, 6 months. Then, of course, you have to revise it, and then you resubmit, and very often you have 2 or 3 of these rounds. So from the moment you have a paper that you consider good enough to be submitted, to the moment you have a paper accepted, let alone published, but accepted is good enough for us, easily 2 or 2.5 years go by. And the tenure clock today in many academic departments is 6 or 7 years. So it is really critical for you to be fast and have this papers published. Now, what is interesting is you cannot submit the same paper to 2 different journals. Legal scholars do that all the time, is sort of accepted. In economics, this is a no-no. In a sense, the way which you want to be expelled from the profession is to do that.
Yeah.
And so why do I think that's important? So first of all, it is funny that economists were so in favor of competition. They don't use competition in this particular case.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And the second aspect is, suppose I am a young assistant professor. I submitted my paper. I got the first revise and resubmit. Then I got my second revise and resubmit. So I'm toward the end. This is an important journal. Publishing in this journal may make the difference between being promoted in a top university or having to look for a job and go down the pecking order of the academic department. Now, suppose the editor asks me to sort of omit a certain part of my paper because he thinks it's not interesting. Of course, the editor will never say, I don't want this because this is bad for my business. But we say, I want you to omit this part because it's interesting or it's not well documented, or I would like you to spin the article in this particular way. And, very often the articles are not read for what is in it, but for the way they're sort of presented. I think it takes really a hero to resist this pressure, especially when you don't think that this is going to change dramatically the paper. And again, it doesn't change dramatically a paper, but if you can exert this pressure on a systematic basis, this might change a lot of outcomes.
So there are a handful of editors who are in this position, have the opportunity to push or change a little bit or just reject an article by sending it to the referees that the editor knows won't like them. That's a whole other issue. Won't like the paper. But why would an editor care? What's in it for the editor?
First of all, people tend to assume over the years a position, which is in part is the result of their studies, and there's nothing bad about it. We all have sort of our view of the world, and ideally these views of the world are the result of what we learn over the course of our sort of life. But they're also influenced by what they do. So if they are expert witnesses in antitrust cases where they mostly take the side against the DOJ, then they are more likely to sort of see as negative a paper that will point out the benefit of antitrust or the cost of excessive market concentration. And again, I'm not saying that they do it on purpose because they get paid for it. It's more subtle, we all have our biases that are driven by a lot of things, and one of the biases might be this one. And as I said before, if we are in a large, there are a lot of important publications, and the biases go all sort of ways. When we take the average, they cancel out. But the moment the prestigious journals are few and the editors are few, and they tend to be sort of more likely hired on one side rather than the other of an antitrust case, then we potentially have a problem.
And this is also an issue you mentioned about sitting on corporate boards. Do you think a lot of editors sit on corporate boards in economics?
Not a lot, but some. I, for full disclosure, I want to be very clear. I am a business school professor. I sit on a board, and occasionally I do expert witness. So I'm not trying to sort of demonize everybody.
And I would just point out that on your webpage you have a disclosure of potential conflicts of interest where you list, as far as I know,
yes,
accurately.
Absolutely.
I don't know, but you list some of the places.
Actually, I need to update it. It's a bit old.
Okay, but still, I've never seen anyone do that before in economics. It happens in other fields, so that's very impressive. I like that.
I think that this is important, and I think that the problem is, first of all, is not to be aware, but second, again, if you are on a board, you tend to view the world more from a particular perspective. And if you start saying that CEOs are overpaid, I think you're less likely to join a board.
You think so?
And less likely to remain on a board.
So let's talk about that issue. The empirical evidence in this paper is on CEO compensation. We just had Thomas Piketty on EconTalk recently, and he is of the view that corporate governance is totally messed up. The board is for the CEO is just a bunch of cronies and friends who rubber stamp raises, and they can push the board around. An alternative view, and that view is widely held by many economists, but there's an alternative view which is no, it's much more competitive than you think. CEO salaries are earned in a competitive marketplace, more or less. Of course, there's some exceptions, but in general, CEOs earn what they're paid. So how did you go about studying whether there's a bias in the views that people have?
So what I did, this is not particularly deep, but what I did is the following. The Initiative on Global Markets at the University of Chicago does a survey of economists on a number of topics. And for a while, I was actually part of the economists that were surveyed. And one of the questions at some point was asked was sort of whether they thought that CEOs were paid above their marginal productivity. And what is interesting is that these people not only state their opinion, but they state their opinion with their name attached. So you can go on the website of the IGM and see exactly how they voted. So I simply took this vote and I correlated the sort of their opinion with whether they serve on the board or not. And I even took out my own name so that the sample was not biased. And what I clearly show is that you're much more likely to think that CEOs are paid above their marginal productivity if you don't sit on a board. If you sit on the board, you don't think that way. And I don't know whether it's because people are selected in one way or another. So if I have a very negative view, I'm less likely to be invited, or even I'm less likely to join a board. I suspect that Thomas Piketty is not somebody that people will invite on a board. Actually, I will not invite him on a board, but for different reasons. But anyway, I don't think that it's very likely to be invited on sitting on a board. Maybe the board of a publicly owned firm in France, but not a business in America. And is less likely to be even wanted if asked. So that's one part. The other is that once you are there, you tend to shape the view a bit. And this is one of the thing I find most puzzling is that one of the people answering the survey is a very famous economist who actually wrote some models of tournament where naturally a CEO is paying more than his or her marginal productivity because the compensation is a price. Like if you win the Riders' Cup or whatever, a big tournament, you are paying more than your marginal productivity. Why? Because that price motivates everybody along the hierarchy, which is perfectly efficient. In spite of the fact he's author of these papers, he says that he doesn't believe CEOs are paid above their marginal productivity, which I find a bit funny.
Well, but we know why he wrote that. There's a non-creepy way to understand that, which was he understood to be a political question, really, and not a literal question on economic theory. And he doesn't think there's anything wrong with how CEOs are paid. But put that to the side.
No, but wait a second. The purpose of that survey is to shed the economist's view into the real world. How economists think about that. So if you give a political view, then why do we ask economists?
Well, that's a separate question. But I guarantee you that many people on that survey answer those questions, whether you want to call it strategically or they don't literally look at the wording of the question. They just like every survey, just like people who answer surveys often have to interpret the words in a different way. But I take your point, and I think it's a fabulous point, that there's possibly a subtle bias going on there. How big are the magnitudes of that finding? You found them to be statistically significant. Are the magnitudes, are they large? Is it 99% of the people who are on board say it's a good idea, and 99% of the people who aren't on boards think they get paid more than their marginal product?
No, I don't remember the exact magnitude. I don't think they're huge. So to be honest, it's very difficult to assess the magnitude. But to be fair, it's also difficult to assess the magnitude of regulatory capture. So I'm not trying to say that it's absolute. I'm just saying that we're not very different from regulators. And so if economists think that regulators are so terrible, that at least should look themselves in the mirror.
So I'm going to look myself in the mirror. And this summer I did a number of interviews in Silicon Valley with venture capitalists and with entrepreneurs. And I find them extremely impressive. And I like what they're doing to change the world. And I suspect that my interviews this summer of those people were a little bit softer than they might have otherwise been because I have a certain respect and admiration for their skill. And you talk about this. You talk about how economists admire innovators and business leaders and that might distort our judgment. How might that work?
I think that is a fascination with the topic. And again, I want to be clear here. I do admire greatly many venture capitalists. I think that many of them create a lot of values. But I think as a researcher, we should be objective and realize that not all of them create value, first of all. And second, when you are a marginal investor in this business, you probably are losing your money because the top venture capitalists reserve their investment for old clients. So if I'm a new client trying to enter into this world, I get left with the leftovers, and those are not particularly good. So I think that we need to be very careful not to lose our objectivity, and I think sometimes keeping some distance is important. And one of the trend that concerns me is that, which is a good trend for other reasons, but concerns me from a capture point of view, is that it used to be the case that a lot of research in economics was archival research. So if you just look at data and you don't interact with the bugs, then you're not sort of captured by the bugs. The moment you start to do research that is more involved with the bugs, on the one hand is better because it's more related to the real world. On the other hand, might be a bit too closely related to the real world. So I think that this is the tension, intrinsic tension, especially for business school professors like me, because even if you might argue that doctors might be biased, but doctors don't have by design that they have to interact with businessmen. Business professors by design need to sort of study business and to some extent interact with the bugs. So it's much more difficult for them to retain their objectivity than it is for any other kind of profession, except maybe lawyers.
So we're going to talk in a second about some of the ways that you suggest we might fight against these biases. But before we do, I want to ask you a broad question. You mentioned in there in your one of the issues that we did not talk about yet, but one of the issues you do talk about in the essay is that donations to a university and to various departments, not just in economics, by the way. You talk about economics and particularly business schools, which are always trying to raise money. But, of course, other departments as well, particularly in the sciences, the medical school. There's an enormous amount of money flowing into universities and then an enormous amount of money flowing to academics for consulting, for boardships, for being a public figure. There are many, many ways that economists make money today that compared to the past. And I think there's been a real transformation of university and academic life in many, many fields, not all fields. French literature is still pretty quiet, but in many, many fields, in science, I like to mention Balzac whenever I can, in science and in economics and in business and in law, there's a lot more money flowing into this so-called nonprofit institution compared to, say, 50 years ago. You go back to, say, 1964, university life, academic life was about scholarship, and it was about teaching, and it was about research. Now, to a large extent, there's a huge entrepreneurial element in both the university and in the scholar's life that was not there in many fields. And I think what you're identifying here is the downside of that.
Yeah, and as everything in economics, there is an upside and a downside. There's a cost and the benefits. And I think that the money flowing into the academia is very useful in many dimensions and has improved the quality of research, etc. So I don't think the solution is to stop that, but I think we should be aware that it might corrupt things in a very subtle way. In a sense, fortunately, I was never in a situation in which there was any compromise of academic integrity. I never witnessed anybody in any committee or anything that say we should promote or not promote this person because the research has been good for fundraising or has been bad for fundraising. However, things are a bit more nuanced in the sense that if your research is very popular because it's been picked up by a lot of business newspapers, you're probably more likely to be tenure. And if your research is very criticized by the business world, you have a harder time to be promoted in a business school. Not directly, but I think indirectly. Nobody will ever say you did not help us raise money, but you see your colleague who have research that they present in a lot of business circle and get a lot of accolades that are treated better. And people see that and learn.
Of course, if you write an anti-business paper, you might have a better chance of getting tenure in a different department. Because one of the things that's I think you underplay, although you allude to it, you don't ignore it, but one of the things you underplay is the role of ideology. So whether you're pro-business, anti-business, whether you're a pawn implicitly or explicitly of business because you have a chance to make money there, the bigger, equally important issue, I think, in economics, as EconTalk listeners know, is that we all have an ideology, and it seems to me that empirical work in economics is extraordinarily predictable. It's not the fact that the person sits on a board and writes a pro-business paper. It's that a person's a free marketer. They're going to find a free market result. And a person who's an interventionist is going to find an interventionist result. And that seems to me to be the most appalling, along with what you're identifying. It all goes together. The real problem at the heart of our profession.
I agree with that, but I think that paradoxically, what is most difficult to find is somebody who is pro-market but not pro-business, because there are a lot of people who have an anti-business ideology, and they probably get hired and promoted in anti-business groups and department and so on and so forth. But if you are not an anti-business person, then the temptation of tilting things a bit in the direction of pro-business, even if this is not necessarily pro-market, is quite strong. And so my view is the area of conservative pro-market economists tend to be particularly distorted in this respect, because ideologically is not on the other side of the world. And so if on the margin you get a better life by not tilting very much your views, you're more likely to do it.
Yeah, that's really depressing because, first of all, you're at the University of Chicago where Milton Friedman in the economics department would constantly say, I'm pro-market, not pro-business. And he would also point out that most businesses are anti-market. They're pro-market for everyone else except their industry, which always has a special exception. And I think the issue here is extremely important because, especially in your situation, if I may turn the dial around, it's a finance problem in particular because most people who are so-called free market are very uncomfortable criticizing financial institutions from a business school perspective. And I don't, whether it's because I'm not in a business school, I don't know, or whether it's because I have a stronger ideology. But when I say things like, well, the financial sector tends to influence policy in a really corrupt and unhealthy way, people say to me, well, how can you be so critical of them? They're just doing what's in their natural self-interest. I'm saying, yeah, that's in their natural self-interest. That's what's wrong with it. And the natural self-interest is to influence regulation, and we should be trying to stop it. Not saying, well, what can you blame them? And then to blame the politicians for trying to stop that. That's bizarre.
Yeah, I think it is bizarre. And I think it's a leftover of a time where sort of every form of lobbying was a lobbying to get the government off your back, which as free marketeers, we're all in favor. Now a lot of the lobbying has become how to get the government in your pocket. Yeah. And I think that is the big change that a lot of people on the more conservative side of the political spectrum have not fully appreciated. And I think that's the important thing to understand.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree with that. So let's move to some of your suggestions for what might improve the quality of economics, economists' honesty and integrity. One of them is shame. So what role might shame play?
So I think that there is a lot of peer pressure in the academic community. And so you're not going to write a paper that says outrageous things or not well-justified things because you are kept in check by your colleagues. Unfortunately, when we move outside of academic environment and we do expert witnesses or other advice, this is less the case. It's true that in expert witnesses there is sort of another side that challenges you, but it's not always another academic, is in different environment. And most importantly, unless you go up to the final trial, you never get exposed in what you're saying.
You can say some really bad things and no one will find out except the lawyers.
Exactly. So one of my proposals, which is very simple, is to say, why don't we pass a regulation to say after 2, 3, 5 years, a reasonable amount of time, every opinion given in a trial is fully disclosed. Then academics will be much more careful in what they say because they're embarrassed to be shamed by their colleagues.
Yep. Now, the problem with this, I just want to give two examples came to mind when I read this. One is, well, let me read your quote and then I'll give the other example. You say very nicely, you say, quote, an economist who always opposes government intervention but then makes an exception when the government bails out a certain industry where he has a direct interest could be easily exposed to the public ridicule. And I find it fascinating. I think about Alan Greenspan when I read this. Alan Greenspan, for some reason, has a reputation as being a hardcore free market person. I think that reputation comes from the fact that he was friends with Ayn Rand, who was a hardcore free market person. But once Alan Greenspan was chair of the Fed, he wasn't much of a free marketer. In particular, he always, as far as I can tell, and that's my bias, maybe there's some exceptions, but he often at least would support government regulation subsidies to the financial sector and violate his so-called free market principles. So my favorite example is the 1995 Mexican rescue, where he testified in front of Congress, said, this is a terrible idea to guarantee Mexican loans, but we have to do it. And of course, one reason we had to do it was because a lot of the people who profited from those loans and who would lose a lot of money if Mexico couldn't continue to borrow was the financial sector, which Alan Greenspan was, of course, at the top of. Those are the people he chatted with, as you point out. Those are the people he interacted with. Those were those 212 phone calls that said a whole variety of things, but probably most of them involved being nice to the financial sector. So it's interesting that we did not ridicule him sufficiently at the time. I don't think he got much ridicule. In fact, he was probably honored for being pragmatic. And I think economists should have spoken out against that. The second example I want to give is from your book, is from the essay. You say, it's a kind of I got a kick out of it for a variety of reasons. You say, for example, in years past, many famous economists wrote papers commissioned by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. In some of these papers, they were going as far as saying that, quote, this analysis shows that based on historical data, the probability of a shock as severe as embodied in the risk-based capital standard is substantially less than 1 in 500,000 and maybe smaller than 1 in 3 million. Still, you continue, the authors do not seem to have suffered any consequence of these wrong statements. In fact, one of these authors was promoted director of the Office of Management and Budget and later hired as vice chairman of global banking at Citigroup. And that was Mr. Orzog. One of the other authors, of course, was Joseph Stiglitz. Now, to defend them, and I don't trot this example out because when I talk about the financial crisis, because you could defend them by saying, well, they weren't really talking about this kind of risk, the kind of risk that it ended up with. It was a different kind of risk. But the fact is they took money, they wrote a paper on behalf of Fannie and Freddie. They didn't get a lot of ridicule for it. And I suspect they did from you and me, maybe, or people like us. But in general, part of the problem is who really wants to get Joseph Stiglitz mad at him? I don't mind so much. He's already been a guest on EconTalk. So I could say something negative about him. And again, I'm trying to be fair to him. I don't think he wrote a horrible paper. I think he wrote a paper that helped Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I don't think he's totally wrong in his prediction, even though it turned out to be the case that it was very risky. But the point is that who wants to get them mad at you? Who wants to get Peter Orszag mad at you? These are influential people who can affect your career. So that the problem just gets pushed off a little bit, I think, even though the shaming thing has potential.
Yeah, and I do say in my essay that shaming very important people might have some return. We see that, for example, CNN has an interesting program called Keeping Them Honest, where they check the facts and see of the politicians, to what extent they lie or misrepresent the facts in debates. But I don't think that economists are so sexy that they're worth a CNN program or something like that. I think that this is one of those things that should be done by some NGOs, because I think that academic economists are very sensitive to their reputation, and I think that having some form of discipline will have an impact.
What about changes to the publication process? I found those very interesting. What would you recommend?
I think that I would like to see more competition in the market because young assistant professor will be less captured by the editor. And also, I think would be useful to have editors not play particular role while editors. I think that there is a funny attitude in even in finance where we tend to be ashamed to pay our editors. I think that being an editor is an awful job and needs to be highly compensated if you do a good job, and as a result should compensate you enough that you have no time and no interest of doing anything else rather than teaching and being an editor. And I think that this should continue even for a couple of years after you step down as an editor. I think that I'm very happy to pay more for that. But have this independence, I think, is important.
Of course, we could do the same thing on the regulatory side. We could pay regulators a lot more so that the revolving door was not as attractive to walk through and have them turn to industry. I guess that's not
absolutely
happening.
No, absolutely. But the funny thing is, I understand that in the public sector, money is more scarce, and also the mentality is you don't want to pay people a lot. But the funny thing is that even in the finance profession, where a lot of professors say you should reward CEOs a lot and etc., when it comes to rewarding a lot the editor of the Journal of Finance, they seem to have objections.
Are you an editor of the Journal of Finance, Luigi?
No, never.
Have you been one?
Full disclosure.
Do you
no,
hope
I've
to be
never been
one? Do you hope to be one?
I don't hope to be one. I am, in this moment, the president of the American Finance Association. So, and I think that currently we do pay our editors, but in the past this was a battle because a lot of people were resisting it.
So, last one of the things you talk about is awareness, which is some might say is naive, but I do like it. I'm a big fan of awareness. So, what's your argument there?
I think that is not a perfect solution, but I definitely is the first step in the right direction. Without that step, is impossible to achieve any result. And what I find it funny is that even this step is so difficult to do. I had a lot of people rejecting completely out of totally my arguments, saying that this don't apply to them. And to me, that's
the best,
so
isn't it? Isn't that the best? Well, that just proves the point. That's what's so beautiful about that. I've heard that from guests on EconTalk. I'm not going to name them, but they say, "Of course, I'm not biased. I separate my ideology from my research." And similarly, Paul Krugman, who by the way, people ask me, when's he going to be a guest on EconTalk? And my answer is whenever he'd like. I've invited him before. He may not have received the emails. He's a busy man, but I'd love to have him on. But having said that, he in response to something I wrote once said, where I confessed that I had an ideology and maybe was biased, he said he does not. He's only a truth seeker. And this is a man whose blog is called The Conscience of a Liberal. So it's interesting that he sees himself. We all have a tendency to see ourselves as these pure truth seekers. We have a lot of romance about our profession, about our careers, and about ourselves. And when somebody says, "Yeah, that's a great point, but it doesn't apply to me," it's hard to know what to say except to laugh.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said it perfectly. And on the other hand, there are people who do have this awareness. I was very impressed a few years ago when I went to the European Central Bank, and I was talking with one of their top-level person who was dealing with the market every day, and he had this view that if the ECB did not intervene to save Greece, there will be a disaster. And so I asked him point blank, because I can be pretty obnoxious sometimes. So I asked him sort of, don't you think that the fact that you deal with the market every day impacts your views? And he was very honest. I was impressed because he said, yes, I think that I'm well aware of this. I try every day to undo this bias. Whether I succeed or not remains to be seen. And I think sort of chapeau to this person, and that's what we should all try to do. I think that, as you said, people who don't even consider the possibility of being biased probably are the ones who are the most biased.
Yeah, although in the case of your friend at the ECB, I think the real challenge there is what do you do about that if you have that awareness? And one of the things you do is you try to listen to some other voices, which is one of your points, right? You look for a little diversity. You don't just call 212. You mentioned Hank Paulson and talking to his friends in the financial sector. He talked to Lloyd Blankfein 24 times, I think, in the week or 2 weeks before the AIG bailout. I wonder how many other people he talked to, but my joke is they didn't talk about how their kids were doing. They probably talked about how the world needed to be saved by making sure that AIG paid out all the money that it had promised, even though it's one of its largest clients. Just coincidentally, it was Goldman Sachs that Lloyd Blankfein was the chair of and that Hank Paulson was the former chair of. So one seems to me one of the lessons of awareness has to be, one of the implications of awareness has to be getting a wider set of information. But the other point, it seems to me, is to invoke Adam Smith's impartial spectator, and not an imaginary one as Smith invokes, but a real one. Find somebody who's not connected to the industry, who isn't always hearing that Greece has to be bailed out or the world will come to an end, and see what they think. And I think that's extremely hard to do for people in those positions because of the incentives.
Yes, but I think this is suggesting something important also in corporate boards, that we need diversity, not so much in terms of gender, also in terms of gender, but not so only in terms of gender, also in terms of backgrounds, in terms of view of the world, in terms of circles, and so on and so forth. I always tell my students that if you want to be a contrarian, you have to live in Omaha, Nebraska. You cannot live in New York or Connecticut and be a contrarian.
Yeah, you got if you want to get invited to the cocktail parties that matter, you better be thinking like everybody else. Last question. I was going to ask you about reactions from colleagues, but I think you've already kind of given me an idea of that. Although you're welcome to say something about. There may be a few who have said, "Wow, that's really scary." Does anybody like your paper?
Yeah, some people like the paper, but I have to say that the most fascinating reaction is I presented this a few years ago here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and there were a group of people from Harvard Business School and a group of academic economists. And these people from Harvard Business School were more like the case type. They were not like truly academic. And in the paper, I make some examples about research and some example also about Harvard business cases where sort of capture tend to be quite obvious. And what was interesting is the Harvard HBS guys were saying, the case idea is completely wrong, but we think that's true for the academic economists.
Oh, of course.
And of course, the academic economists were saying that they could see that for the HBS cases, but of course not for their research.
Yeah, I think I could have predicted that, but it's still depressing to find that prediction to be accurate. Let me close then with this. It seems to me that, these are fascinating issues. They, I think they're really important. But isn't the underlying problem the fact that when we say something stupid or something that is inaccurate, it's very difficult to hold our feet to the fire because economics is very, very difficult to pin down. So I make a prediction. Say, hypothetically, I say that if we spend, $800 billion in increased government spending during a recession, it's going to create so many jobs. Now, that turns out that prediction was wrong. It was just turned out to be wrong. But of course, there's a story to tell afterwards as to why it was wrong. It doesn't really mean I didn't understand it. I didn't really appreciate the size of this variable or whatever. And there's plenty of examples on the free market side, the most obvious being inflation. So some of us on the free market side predict inflation. When it doesn't happen, we have a story to tell. The money's tied up in the banks. Why we didn't think of that in advance, I don't know. But that we have stories to tell. Since there's always storytelling going on, it seems to me it's very difficult to hold economists accountable for what they say, and therefore these type of biases can persist. And that raises, you can agree or disagree with that. And then I want you to answer the tougher question, which is, given that our pronouncements cannot be verified in any often real way, why are we so influential? So that's my closing question. Answer it any way you'd like, Luigi.
I think that the reason why we're so influential is because the decisions that are related to us are so damn important. I think that we, to some extent, underinvest in study economics because the benefit of avoiding a Great Depression is so large that any reasonable amount of money spent in trying to study how to avoid it is well spent. So I think that not that we necessarily spend it well, I don't want to sort of be self-serving here, but I think that the stakes are incredibly high. And so it's a bit like why a lot of chartists in Wall Street are so influential is because you can make so much money if you have any predictive power in Wall Street that even if people don't, people try. So I think that's the simple answer to the second question. To the first question, what can I say? I don't know. I think that in academic department, when you have intense summary discussions, you can tell when people are sort of without a good argument or not. I think that there is not enough scrutiny in the public domain. There is a lot of sometimes of fight, but not serious scrutiny. So it's true, we cannot predict things with high degree of accuracy, but I think that if people change their view depending on what is convenient, and especially in issues that have more to do with microeconomics than macro, I think we can tell things apart much better.
My guest today has been Luigi Zingales. Luigi, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
My pleasure.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.